My name is Wyatt Graham. This is Word and Words. I'm joined by Andrew Noble and Phil Cotnoir. And we're going to talk today about the very, very thrilling topic of how to read a book. And if we're going to get really controversial, we might even get into how to read a sentence and possibly even a clause. Because we know that this is a pressing question for everybody on the internet these days. To sort of set the scope of the discussion, I know that, Andrew, you've been reading a book on how to read a book. I don't know how you read it without first having read the book. It seems to be a chicken and egg situation, but maybe you can kind of explain a little bit about your journey through that book and set the stage for the conversation.
Sure. Mortimer Adler, How to Read a Book, very famous book from the 1950s. And I have pushed off reading books of this nature because I thought it was just too obvious. And then you recommended it, and I was like, yeah, I should totally read one of these books. And I found it helpful. I think one of the big misconceptions that exists is certain criteria for reading a book. There's either you either read it front to back or you don't. Those are the only two options. Like, as if there's no other level of complexity. And so one of the things that Mortimer argues is we kind of learn how to read to like a 6th or 7th grade level, and then we think that that's it. And then we go through life not really reading what he calls an analytical way, which is understanding and being able to explain and even critique the author's argument and what's in the argument itself and what's missing. It's a lot of logic in the book. It's interesting. But yeah, I think my own journey is starting a PhD and wanting to do a good job, and also recognizing that there are way too many books to read compared to what I should read. Like I just don't have enough time yet. I need to be an expert in 4 disciplines. So how am I going to do this? I need to think about how to read a book well. And you got to think about like speed reading. And it's not as simple like as just slow down and read slowly. That's how you read a book. Like, make sure you pay attention to context. There's actually a lot more wisdom that needs to be unpacked, and I think that's what we can do in this episode so that we don't waste time on bad books. We don't waste time on bad chapters, that we know how to critique and what needs to go into critiquing a book when we do so, how to compare different books and themes together. And this is like some common sense logic stuff that informs hermeneutics, how we read the Bible, but it also informs how we approach social media and any kind of aspect of our reading experience. So it does relate to how we read clauses on Twitter as well.
Well, that's really helpful. And I think what you kind of explained was it's not literally how to read the sounds on a page, but how to read wisely and with understanding. That's two things. Almost anyone today, can articulate verbally the sounds on a page, with interpreting the symbols that are words. But I would argue that few of us today can really read deeply with understanding, with wisdom. And part of that is, if you read a book by C.S. Lewis or an article or an essay by him, he's alluding to 1,000 years of other prior writings, and there's a deep well of prior concepts and realities that are part of his ability to read and interpret the symbols on a page, the symbols of the alphabet and the words that they create, which we don't always have. I mean, it's like a deeper question. So there's almost like this forgetfulness of our past tradition, our neglect of wisdom, and our embrace of technique and the way of the future that has created a reality that we really can't understand easily, the old and great books. And then a second point I want to say before I pass it on to Phil is, based on what you said, you have to read a lot of books in your PhD. One of the things that I've discovered is that most books written are not worth reading well. They're not worth reading slow. They're not worth reading chewing on every sentence. Doesn't mean that they're not useful for any reason, but their use could be, this book has a very academic format, thesis, 7 arguments, contrary arguments, and conclusion. And what you're doing when you look at that is understanding, okay, is there a satisfactory counter-argument, our argument that might satisfy this or that historical claim? That could be it, and you can maybe do that in 20 minutes. And yet there is a genre of book that is worth chewing on and meditating on. Like some books are, what is that famous thing? Some books are to be, tasted. Some books are to be, chewed, and some books are to be swallowed, or whatever it is. And, Ezekiel and John eat a book because it's valuable. And I think there's a sense in which, we have to quote a Bible verse because that's the only way we can know how to read a book.
Of course.
I think there is a sense in which there are some great books that are worth reading slowly. There's some books like Augustine's Confessions I read over and over, sometimes very slowly, meditatively, or like Athanasius' On the Incarnation, or the Theological Orations of Gregory of Nazianzus, and others. And I can't plumb the depth of them because they're written at a level where I need to keep going back. And it's not because I don't understand the words, but the words often have deep references to other events, other realities, other concepts, an emotional piece, an affectional piece. And when I come back, especially at different stages in my life, I'm able to pick up on the deeper meaning of those things, because words are windows into reality. They're not the reality itself. Words are symbols, and if you just think the pages are, it's a game of symbols and sounds, you're going to be very, very excited about chiasms all day or whatever, some literary structures, but you'll never actually move past symbols to the reality itself, the meaning itself, whatever that is, love, justice, truth, etc. And I think we've kind of lost that because most of our books are technical instructions on how to accomplish a technique. How do you grow your YouTube audience in 10 weeks by 10 times? Here are the 10 steps. That's the kind of thing that we read today, which, the symbols just create more symbols. The symbols lead to symbols, not to deep realities. Okay, that was a bit rambly, so Phil, be smart, unlike me.
Well, yeah, I love this topic. I think it's a great question. I think it's worth thinking about. Let me just throw out a couple of things. One practical thing, and to be fair, I haven't read Mortimer Adler's book, which I should. I should, because I love reading books and I think I could do it better. And I'd love to see how he guides that process. But here's a couple of things that I have sort of adopted, because I have often had the experience of reading a book and finishing it and feeling like, okay, this should have been a pamphlet. There was one chapter's worth of meat, and then there was like a number of follow-up chapters of rehashing and sort of like casting a bit of light from a different perspective on the same idea. And so, like you guys have said, not every book is worth one's devoted attention. What I tend to do is I tend to look at endorsements. I tend to look at footnotes and endnotes and bibliography. It kind of gives you an idea of the intellectual ecosystem in which this author is swimming. And if I see a bunch of references to authors whose work I already know well, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to be confronted with an argument that may be true and good, but not going to be of particular high value for me. Or if I see that they're not really interacting with anyone that I think is interesting, then I'm not going to be very drawn to take it seriously. I often also will flip through the first couple pages of a chapter and the concluding paragraphs of a chapter to get a sense of the overall thesis. And this kind of helps me decide, okay, is this worth diving into? So when I'm picking up a book, I'm wanting to kind of just evaluate it. If I really don't know much about it, that's kind of what I'm looking for. I'm looking at the publisher and things like that. But I want to say something else too. There are some authors, like you were saying, Wyatt, who are drawing on such a deep well of reading, and also not just reading, but whole ways of conceiving reality. They serve as like gateways. So I think for some people, you might disagree, Wyatt, but for some people, picking up Augustine's Confessions may be too jarring, and a little bit too remote to really get into, even though he's quite readable. I think it's useful to have authors who serve as gateways, who are deeply read in those things and can reformulate those ideas in more contemporary language. I mean, I think of C.S. Lewis as a classic example of someone who, both in the classics, but especially in the whole medieval world, you don't realize it at first, but the more you read him and the more you read about him, you realize everything he's doing in his popular work is sort of reformulating ideas that were central to medieval thought, and that you find in people like Boethius and things like that. And so I'm at the point where now I want to read Boethius because I'm really curious to understand more about the well from which Lewis and others like him were drawing. And so in my own reading, I have found this sort of network effect of, you get into one author, something about them is compelling, it's stimulating, it's helping you think of new things you hadn't encountered before, and then you go to that person's sources, and then that opens up whole new avenues of discovery, and it's a really rewarding process. So those are just a couple of
You kind of talked about the first part, the assessing of the book, and then you talked about like the last part. When it's a good book, it leads you to other things. By the way, like Mortimer Adler talks about the assessing the book, in addition to what you mentioned, like the front and back and concluding stuff, like table of contents, those sorts of things are super helpful to just go through. Yeah, he says like an author can't help but try to summarize his thoughts at the end of a book, and therefore take advantage of that. Read the last chapter first, or go through the table of contents to see what's needed. So yeah, like I think you're onto something there, and I think those are helpful pieces to keep in mind. I also think there's just a way of approaching a book where, do you need to understand everything in every sentence, or is it okay to just be confused and just keep reading? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people misunderstand that aspect of reading. Adler again talks about this. It's like, if you don't misunderstand, like if you don't have that sense of, oh, this is difficult, you're probably not learning, right? Any new skill, any new knowledge, it's going to hurt a little bit at first. Like, we don't need to belabor the point. That's just the way we learn, is sometimes through this initial inertia that's difficult to get going. And so that's why I think audiobooks are sometimes very helpful, because you don't get stuck. You just are kind of forced to keep going. And there is some benefits there as well. I know, Wyatt, you're really against audiobooks. You don't think they're very helpful. I remember you saying that before.
No, I think audiobooks are a more traditional and more proper way of reading than silent reading. The tradition of books has always been verbal and typically based in memory. Given the writing structure of ancient texts, that you'll see they're very close up. They're actually hard to read by sight. Typically, you probably have to have heard them before to actually read them and interpret them rightly. To find an ancient Greek or Akkadian writing, whether on a tablet or on papyrus or whatever, and then to read it without any oral tradition preceding it would take a long time. And, I have, I think, a box over here with a translation that I did on the Epic of Gilgamesh in Akkadian. I think it's in this box over here or somewhere. And it was slow going, because I didn't know what an Enkidu was, before reading Gilgamesh, but before translating it. But if I did, translation would have been significantly easier. So we've switched, probably due to the printing press and lots of things, to high volume of books, apart from any oral tradition, where reading is often silent. And I think you talked about inertia. I think a lot of difficult reading, therefore, for us, that's new to us, creates a sort of friction. And we're so trained to resist friction and kind of back off that we don't push through. So I think, Phil, you're right earlier to say, yeah, read C.S. Lewis. If you want to, to understand some of the ancient ideas, C.S. Lewis is a great way to be introduced to them. When he talks about the Ordo Amoris, the Order of Loves, which is Augustinian, really, in the City of God, it's going to be easier in Lewis. At the same time, one of the things I found is I think I would have been dumber than I am had I not read a lot of weird ancient people whose ideas were so foreign and so on the face of it false on my first reading, I would have been a lot dumber, because years later, as I read them again, I realized, oh, no, maybe I was the wrong one. And I never would have had that secondary reflection due to the foreignness of ideas had it not pushed through, on weird things. Like, I'll just give you an example. I'm reading right now John Damascus's on divine images, which is these treatises on it. Pretty interesting. I'm not, although I technically have non-venerated icons, which I don't really think that we should non-blessed icons. I don't think we should venerate icons, in my modest Protestant opinion. At the same time, it's interesting to see his argument on it, because it's not as dumb as you might sound. Speaking of a book that's hard to read, I've been reading this book since 2019, and I haven't finished it yet.
Can you move it to the center? I can't see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is a work of singular genius.
Oh, shouldn't I? Translation.
Well, that's the translator. Yeah, I do see. Oh, sorry. Is it reversed on yours?
No.
Ferdinand
no,
Ulrich is the author.
I'm not going to try to pronounce that. That's my main issue.
Homo abyssus. It's the sort of the intellectual framework for a lot of the ressourcement or retrieval, the Roman Catholic retrieval guys in the early 20th century. But he's viewed as a singular philosophical genius, and I'm actually, you can see I'm not that far through, but I've been reading since 2019. And the reason why is the friction hits me, and I have to read about 5 to 10 books to understand that section, and I'm kind of being literal. I'm not joking. But the intellectual labor for me is utterly satisfying, and I can't recommend this book. I mean, unless you want a decade of learning, you're gonna have to at one point read, Hegel and Heidegger. Like, you have to just kind of go through things, and the whole Christian tradition, and also the philosophical distinction between knowing and being. But not that everyone needs to do that. My point to bring that up is, like, yes, go to C.S. Lewis to have something understandable, but challenge yourself.
Yep.
And read things that you think are wrong or weird or strange, and allow your mind to be challenged. Like, one of the things I was talking to my wife about this morning, and I have a radically different view of this than I would have 10 years ago, is like, man, do I ever believe in miracles today? And in the oddity of the world and the strangeness of things. And when you read people who lived in 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, etc., they all do too. And, if you would ask me 10 years ago, I would read, like, Irenaeus, and he would talk about, I saw a resurrection, or I saw this miracle. I'd be like, yeah, whatever. And now I'm like, yeah, probably.
You're becoming
you start
unmodern.
to think thoughts after whatever.
Not that
after you're reading.
it just, it changes you, because you just realize everybody else, this is normal too, and it's because they're unscientific and unmodern. Yeah, but has modernity, the rise of technological society, and the assumption that, I think it's Lewis or someone says, the assumption that when you're walking around a cathedral you won't encounter an angel. Is that actually a better way to live? Or is that Chesterton? Whoever it is. One of those guys. Right. I would rather just think, I might encounter an angel. Who knows? That's a better way to live.
And that's coming from your reading. And so, like, I respect that.
It's the reality itself. The book is just symbols.
Yeah. So you enter into a reality that's not stunted by our modern moment.
Right.
And I'm with you on that. Like, even Mortimer Adler, to keep going back to his book because it's so fresh for me, he talks about, even in the 50s, how there's a push away from discerning the truth in a book. You kind of go towards the entertainment value of a book. So this is always something you see when you're, like, doing a book study with people, and it's like, oh, how are you finding the book? What do you think about it? It's like, oh, I really enjoyed that section. Okay, like, unpack that statement. Like, what do you mean by that? So on one hand, I agree with you, Wyatt, in this pushing against inertia and read hard books. But I think you have to see joy in reading. You talked about this immense satisfaction you get through the labor. I don't think people see that. I think some people even find C.S. Lewis laborious to read through. So, like, how does joy connect and stimulate reading, perhaps, as well as help you persevere in a difficult part? Like, I'm not saying that reading should be whimsical, but there is a way that, reading can give you a deeper joy, not just by allowing you to enter into reality better by reading good books, but there should be a joy in reading that I don't know how to describe it. I don't know how you guys would describe it because I know you guys enjoy reading.
I think it's a great point. I was going to bring this up, Andrew. There's different kinds of reading. There's reading that I labor through, and there's a kind of joy in that. But I think that it's good and correct to also read whimsically. I think, in fact, Alan Jacobs argues for that. I don't know if it's in this little book here, Breaking Bread with the Dead, or in something else that he's written, but he has a kind of a whimsical way of writing and evidently of reading where he's just following his curiosity, and there's something delightful about going into a used bookstore and just picking something off the shelf and just taking a look and taking it home and reading it if it just interests you. I think for me, there's a certain element or a certain kind of thing that I read purely for enjoyment, not for some utilitarian goal of, leveling up my understanding of this or that. But just because it's a gift and language is beautiful and prose that is well written is a delight to the mind. And, just for enjoyment, I think some of the great novels and great prose writers of fiction and nonfiction, are really a joy to read. And I think it'd be a real shame if we only evaluated reading in terms of what it can deliver, and in terms of this kind of maximizing. I understand that we want to be judicious in what we read, and some things are not worth reading. We've been talking about that. There's also something right about the leisure of just reading something for enjoyment, and there's something very human about that, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I would like to add something, and I hope it doesn't sound too woo-woo. You can come to, speaking of joy, how do you get joy? Well, reading could be one way, but I don't want to just isolate it to reading. I mean, you get joy in the beauty of love when you love your wife, all sorts of categories. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to reading, though, I think if you're reading to truly understand reality, so if you're reading a book on, I don't know, color or mathematics, you see the equity and beauty of distribution and justice that's going on through that. I think there's a real sense in which we seek things that are unseen, and our mind can participate in them to however you want to describe that. And you can experience real joy in just knowing deeper truths beyond the symbols on the page. I think there's just a really simple thing. And I don't mean that in a really wild way. I just mean if you just want to know what love is and you read C.S. Lewis's book on Four Loves, whatever it is.
Four Loves.
And you just go, I know love now better. And then as you're loving someone, you just kind of begin to say, this is love. I'm actually in it. I think it's those really simple moments. I have moments in my life. I remember even, just reading a book and coming to really understand, the cross or something like that. And I just had this sort of open up moment to the reality of the infused righteousness given to me, or the imputed righteousness given to me. And it's real. And there's the joy is based on reality. It's not merely, there's a satisfying arrangement of symbols that created a poetic structure and that's cool. But there's something there that's real. Now, it's not just books where you find that. So we're just talking about books. That's why I'm saying that. But I know that maybe sounds a little bit too mystical, but I think on reflection it has to be true to a degree. The things that are great draw us into greater realities. And when I say reality, I mean things that are real, like the grass outside. Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of Hebrews 11, where faith is defined and illustrated through believing in unseen things through things that are seen. And then Hebrews says, all the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when they were seeking a promised land that was seen, they were actually seeking an unseen city, not made with human hands, but whose builder and designer is God. And then the end of the chapter says, but they all died without receiving the promise because, apart from us, they would never have been made perfect. And then you see Jesus coming forward, and he's the founder and perfecter of our faith. And a number of verses down in chapter 12, you see, oh wait, now there's the city of God, that Mount Zion that's unshakable, and around it there are the saints made perfect. and they actually found the city promised for them. The unseen thing through the seen reality of the promise. And I think that's how our world works. You and I are waiting for a city whose builder and designer is gone, that will, as Revelation says, descend from heaven. And so, whatever city on earth that we encounter, every shadow of justice that we see, every taste of goodness that we have, taste and see the Lord is good, every glimmer of love, every light of joy that we experience now is part of the crucible of life, whether that's in books or anything else, that draws us into the future in the present, meaning it draws us into future hope as we live in the present by faith. That's hope, is bringing the future into the present, your present faith. So, I mean, that's the whole faith-hope paradigm of Christianity. It's a bit different. That Platonism is more vertical. We're eschatological, I would say. And so I just find, if you're reading a great book, something that draws you into like deep beauty, deep justice, deep truth, deep illumination, you're accessing something that you're going to experience fully at one point in life. And this is why I'm not a nihilist. I love life, and I have a zest for life. I think, sometimes people say, like, I wish I could just die and get out of here because it's so horrible, but I have like a duty to live here to do a couple good things. And I go, really? Do you think Jesus thought that way, before the cross? No. I mean, he lived a whole scope of life so that he would be a forerunner for us to live the whole scope of life, so that we might know the crucible of life, so that we might live in joy of the deposit ready to be revealed to us. And I think whenever we're reading and we access these deeper truths, realities, substances, whatever you want to call them, there is where we're opening our imagination up to the things that we hope for and believe in through these, through the seen signs of books, or the seen signs of community, or the seen signs of justice, or the seen signs of a loving marriage, whatever it is, to the unseen things that are ours in hope and not yet fully realized. Sorry, was that too woo-woo?
No. It's interesting how much our podcast name is getting reverberated episode after episode. Like this is kind of going back to the reality, and how important it is to figure out what reality is. And that's why the reading of books needs to pursue truth, so that you live in accordance with the truth. And as much as a book is able to enlighten you, as you're kind of describing, so to speak, enlighten you to reality, the more it's going to change your life, because it will lead to a kind of authority, as you better understand reality and you better understand the authority that's connected to that reality. You will then live under that reality for the sake of freedom and joy and flourishing and all this kind of stuff. I'm working through Christopher Wright's Ethics, not front to back, but just skipping around to figure out what I need. He talks about being indebted to Oliver O'Donovan. He says he's indebted to his book, Resurrection, the Moral Order. O'Donovan argues that authority is a dimension of reality which constitutes sufficient and meaningful grounds for action. The created order itself, by its reality, provides an authoritative structure within which we have freedom to act, both in the sense of permission to act as well as the wide range of legitimate options for our action. And I don't know. So I'm like even working through this right now on my own, trying to figure out in my own PhD stuff, how am I going to relate the ethics to the reality of the both the biblical world as well as the world we see in technology. Anyways, I'm getting distracted from the main thing in relation to books. But this is why when you read a book, you need to ask yourself, is this true? Is this argument correct? Is there evidence for this argument? Is the author providing justification for this? Do I understand the author's argument? Do I know their terms? Like good authors will use terms in very particular ways, and you need to follow that logic in order to see if it is true and does it accord with the reality that you've experienced in the world and in Scripture.
Well, what about the reading of fiction? Where's the place of novels in or for you guys, in your philosophy of reading?
None.
Really?
No, I'm just kidding.
I was like, that was surprising. Well, I would say for me, I was just watching this little interchange between Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins, kind of and Dawkins was like, what's true is sort of factually and scientifically verified. And Peterson, although somewhat confusing, was like, Dostoevsky has true things, you know. And for me, I actually think fiction, good fiction, that teaches you to love what is good and to hate what is evil, is it's teaching you habits of the mind and accessing truths that are beyond scientific verification but are real. So the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy is kind of based about hope. It's hope. That's the virtue. So you want to know hope, you read that trilogy, and it gives you the moral imagination to know what hope is. That's, I mean, obviously just a very quick summary. There's more to the story. So I love fiction, especially science fiction and fantasy fiction, because they have the freedom to pursue a story based on the ideas that are true, like love, joy, hope, etc., justice. Now, of course, a lot of stories don't believe that ideas are true. They think that ideas are conventional, and that's why a lot of fantasy fiction today is very meaningless, or it's all signs, no realities. A lot of fiction is just signs and no realities. But if there is true things like justice and love and so on, and you write a book about, like, I'll give you maybe one controversial example. Or should I? No, I'll let Andrew go instead.
I would say that I know that fiction's important, but I'm not so good at, like, when I want to choose a book to read, or when I choose a book, I tend to go to the nonfiction, and that's just kind of my motivation and what motivates me to read, and I find that enjoyable. So I tend to do what gives me joy, and that tends to be nonfiction. Though I've gotten more into fiction recently, and I see the way that it shapes minds and reflects human nature in ways that prose can't. So you going through like That Hideous Strength, you're going to learn something about human nature that can't be expressed in The Abolition of Man. If you're going through something like 1984 and something like that, this pursuit of freedom and this sense of autonomy and trying to place the speck of dust so that just in the right spot on the book, so that nobody else will know that you've opened this secret journal and written in it, and you'll place the piece of dust back on it. It gives you an imagination about something, and we're story formed people. Like that's why God wrote a story. So I just think that God is a story. God has made us to be story formed, and we live in stories. That's not the same thing as saying we live in worldviews, but yeah, it's super important. But I openly admit to not prioritizing fiction. A friend of mine, we always read books together, which is another way of a tip for reading more books, or reading books well, is to have someone to talk through with it so that you can see if you understand the book in your own words and all that kind of stuff. So we read books together, and we decided to read a fiction. He's like, we need to read a good fiction book. So I picked like Frankenstein from 200 years ago. So I'm going to work through that. Because I'd rather read old fiction books. I find that they're better. They last the test of time rather than some of the new stuff. But I don't know. Phil, you're probably better than all of us at this kind of thing.
Well, I don't think it's a question of being better or not, but I do love fiction. I've grown in my appreciation for it. I think, in fact, something that Jordan Peterson said I found very helpful. He just kind of laid out that fiction is a way of taking patterns which have happened 10,000 times in reality and distilling them to one time in fiction. And so it becomes a symbol of something. Now, I'm talking about good fiction here. It becomes a symbol of what is true in reality, by being kind of a condensed version of it. And of course, the Russians, like Dostoevsky or Solzhenitsyn or Tolstoy, they tend to do this to the extreme. Their characters are like extreme versions of this or that characteristic, and the narratives are again extreme. But they communicate something powerfully, and they leave an impression on the heart and mind and the memory in a way that is different and perhaps more profound than just reading whatever truth he was trying to communicate in a didactic, statement of the idea. And I think I want to leave room here for different people who are wired differently, to encounter truth in different ways. So I think some people are just going to be drawn to fiction, and others are going to be drawn just more to nonfiction books. But I think there's something good about just immersing yourself in good stories. I mean, I think we all implicitly know this as we raise our kids and give them good stories to read. We want them to be reading Narnia and Lord of the Rings and the fairy tales that have stood the test of time, and these things that embody truths that we might not even really be able to articulate, and yet they shape the imagination and character in profound ways. So, and the other thing I'd say too is I was reading, what was it? It was the book that came out of the Desiring God conference on C.S. Lewis, and it was basically like all the different talks that were given at that conference as chapters. And I think there's one by Doug Wilson about sort of reflecting on the idea of, God as the author of reality. And I wouldn't endorse everything Doug Wilson says, but it was really thought-provoking, and there's a fruitful line of reflection there when you consider narrative, how it works and how the characters work inside it, to how God interacts with the world he's created and all of our lives here in it. So.
Well, I think that's maybe a good way to finish today's podcast. Maybe a final comment is God wrote a book. Maybe we should read books.
Yeah.
And that's about all I have.
That's good.
Thanks for listening to Word and Words.
Thanks for listening.